Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer boasted that it had more stars than there are in heaven, and during Hollywood's golden age, no studio could match MGM's roster of musical talent. They produced the most lavish productions, the most spectacular dance numbers, and the biggest box office hits. Mayer believed that stars weren't born, but made, carefully and cold-bloodedly built up from nothing. But creating stars meant owning them. These are the stories of 9 dancing and singing stars who learned that working for the Dream Factory meant surrendering their bodies to a man who saw them not as artists, but as assets. Gene Kelly. Gene Kelly arrived at MGM in 1942 after establishing himself on Broadway. He was 29 years old, confident, and accustomed to creative control. Mayer and the studio had other ideas. Kelly quickly learned that at MGM, even the biggest stars had to fight for artistic freedom. The studio controlled which projects he could work on, who he could dance with, and how his image would be presented. Kelly wanted to choreograph his own numbers and eventually direct, but MGM resisted giving him that power. When he pushed for more control, the studio reminded him of his contract. Like all MGM stars, Kelly was bound by a 7-year option contract that allowed the studio to drop him at 6-month intervals if he didn't perform at the box office, but kept him legally bound for the full 7 years if he did. It was designed to prevent performers from viewing themselves as independent workers with bargaining power. Kelly fought the system more successfully than some. He eventually won the right to choreograph and co-direct, creating masterpieces like Singin' in the Rain and On the Town. But it came at a cost. Every request for creative control became a battle. The studio loaned him out to other studios as punishment when he became too demanding, sending him to Columbia for CoverGirl in 1944 and later to Warner Brothers. This was a common tactic Mayer used to discipline stars who challenged him. Kelly remained at MGM until 1957, when he left after 15 years. Unlike some performers who were destroyed by the studio system, Kelly managed to maintain his integrity and his health, but only through constant vigilance and willingness to fight. Fred Astaire. Fred Astaire came to MGM in 1940 after establishing himself at RKO, where he'd made his famous films with Ginger Rogers. He was already 41 years old, a star who knew his worth and expected to be treated accordingly. Mayer welcomed him as a prestige acquisition, but made it clear that MGM would control the terms of his employment. Astaire's contract gave him more freedom than younger stars received, partly because of his age and established reputation, but he still operated within MGM's rigid system. The studio decided which films he would make, which partners he would dance with, and when he could take time off. When Astaire wanted to retire from dancing in 1946, exhausted after years of grueling physical work, the studio pressured him to continue. He finally left MGM in 1946 and announced his retirement, but financial pressures and the studio's persistence brought him back. Throughout his time at MGM, Astaire watched younger performers struggle under the weight of studio control. He saw Judy Garland deteriorate. He witnessed the way MGM manufactured and then discarded talent. His own survival came partly from his pre-existing fame and partly from careful navigation of studio politics, but even Astaire couldn't escape entirely. The studio owned his image, controlled his performances, and dictated the terms of his career. Esther Williams. Esther Williams was discovered by MGM talent scouts while working as a swimming instructor in Los Angeles. Mayer saw her potential as a unique commodity, a champion swimmer who could be built into a star. Williams signed with MGM in 1941 and quickly learned how the studio operated. MGM created an entirely new genre of film around her, the aqua musical, elaborate productions featuring synchronized swimming and water ballet. Williams became enormously profitable for the studio, but the physical demands were brutal. She performed her own stunts in water that was often freezing cold, diving from great heights and holding her breath for extended periods while looking graceful and smiling. Williams later recalled the pressure to maintain her figure and her swimming ability while meeting the studio's other demands. MGM controlled her diet, her exercise regimen, and her public image. When she wanted to marry, she needed studio permission. When she became pregnant, the studio's concerns centered on how quickly she could return to filming. Williams remained at MGM throughout the 1940s and 50s, churning out profitable aqua musicals until the genre lost its appeal. When the studio no longer needed her specialty, they released her from her contract. She later spoke about the way MGM used performers, building them up for as long as they were profitable and then moving on without sentiment. Ann Miller. Ann Miller began her film career as a teenager in the 1930s, but her time at MGM began in 1948 when she was signed at age 25. Miller was already an experienced performer, known for her rapid tap dancing and long legs. The studio put her under contract and immediately began dictating every aspect of her career and image. MGM controlled which films she appeared in, though she was often cast in supporting roles rather than leads. The studio determined her hairstyle, her makeup, and even aspects of her personal life. When Miller wanted to marry, the studio had approval over the timing and the publicity. Miller later described Louis B. Mayer as a difficult man to work for, someone who expected complete obedience from his contract players. She saw how the studio treated stars who challenged the system, and she learned to navigate carefully. Like many MGM performers, Miller found that success came with a price. The studio owned her image and controlled her career trajectory. When musicals began to decline in popularity in the mid-1950s, Miller found fewer opportunities. She left MGM when her contract expired and moved into theater work, but her experience at the studio had taught her that performers were commodities to be used and discarded. Cyd Charisse. Cyd Charisse joined MGM in 1946 after years of dancing in the ballet and in small film roles. She was 24 and already married to singer Nico Charisse when the studio signed her. MGM saw her as a perfect dancing partner for their male stars, particularly Fred Astaire and Gene Kelly. Charisse became one of MGM's most beautiful dancers, known for her extraordinary technique and her long legs. But the studio controlled every aspect of her career. She had no say in which films she appeared in or which choreographers she worked with. The physical demands were enormous. Charisse danced for hours each day, often rehearsing the same number dozens of times until it met the director's standards. Injuries were common but rarely accommodated. The studio expected her to dance through pain, and she did. Charisse later spoke about the way MGM manufactured glamour. The studio told her what to wear, how to style her hair, and how to present herself in public. Her marriage to Nico Charisse ended partly due to the pressures of her career, and when she remarried in 1948 to singer Tony Martin, the studio carefully managed the publicity. Charisse remained at MGM until musicals fell out of favor in the late 1950s. When the genre died, so did her career at the studio. Debbie Reynolds. Debbie Reynolds was 16 years old when she was spotted by MGM talent scouts in 1948. Mayer signed her immediately, seeing another potential star to manufacture. Reynolds was young, wholesome, and talented, exactly the kind of performer MGM specialized in creating. The studio put her through their star-making machinery, teaching her how to sing and dance, how to present herself in public, and how to be the girl next door that American audiences would love. Reynolds later spoke about the intense pressure and the constant scrutiny. Everything about her was managed by the studio, from her hairstyle to her dating life. When she fell in love with and married singer Eddie Fisher in 1955, MGM carefully controlled the publicity, turning them into America's sweethearts. The studio worked her constantly, putting her in film after film. The physical demands of dancing in movies like Singin' in the Rain were enormous. Reynolds wasn't a trained dancer when she started that film, and Gene Kelly's perfectionist approach to choreography meant endless rehearsals and brutal criticism. She later said her feet bled during filming. By the time Reynolds matured as an actress and wanted more challenging roles, the studio system was beginning to crumble. MGM's power over its stars was weakening, and performers were starting to demand more control. Reynolds eventually left MGM and successfully transitioned to other studios and to live performance. But her early years at the studio had taught her that talent was only valuable as long as the studio could profit from it. Leslie Caron. Leslie Caron was 18 years old when Gene Kelly discovered her dancing with the Ballet des Champs-Élysées in Paris in 1951. Kelly wanted her for an American in Paris, and MGM brought her to Hollywood. Caron spoke little English and knew nothing about making movies. The studio took complete control, teaching her English, coaching her on how to move in front of cameras, and creating an image for her as a gamin, a childlike innocent who could dance. Caron's contract bound her to MGM for 7 years. She had no say in which films she made or how she was presented. The studio loaned her out to other studios when it suited their purposes, and she had to accept whatever they decided. Caron later described feeling like property during her years under contract. She was grateful for the opportunity to perform, but resented the lack of agency. The studio controlled not just her professional life, but attempted to manage her personal life as well. When she married British theater director Peter Hall in 1956, the studio disapproved, but couldn't prevent it. The marriage created tension because Hall was based in London and Caron was bound to Hollywood. By the time Caron's contract ended, she had become a star, but she had also learned the cost of working in the studio system. She moved to Europe and chose her own projects, refusing to sign another long-term contract that would give anyone that level of control over her life again. Judy Garland. Judy Garland was 13 years old when Louis B. Mayer signed her to MGM in 1935. Her mother Ethel had been pushing her toward stardom since she was 2, and now MGM would take over where Ethel left off. Just a year after signing, when Garland was 14 and about to film her first feature, the studio executives began their campaign against her weight. Mayer himself reportedly called her a fat little pig with pigtails, despite the fact that she was only 4 feet 11 inches tall and naturally petite. The studio put her on a brutal regimen. She was allowed only chicken soup, black coffee, and cigarettes. To suppress her appetite and keep her energy up during 18-hour workdays, MGM doctors gave her amphetamines, pills they called pep pills. To help her sleep after being artificially stimulated for days, they gave her barbiturates. Garland later described the routine in an interview, saying they would give them pep pills to keep them on their feet long after they were exhausted, then take them to the studio hospital and knock them out cold with sleeping pills. Mickey Rooney would be sprawled out on one bed and her on another. After 4 hours, they would wake them and give them the pep-up pills again so they could work 72 hours in a row. This wasn't just Garland's account. Her third husband, Sid Luft, wrote in his memoir that most of her teen and adult life she had been on either Benzedrine or a diet or both. Mayer's control extended beyond pills and diets. Garland later told interviewers that whenever Mayer complimented her voice, saying she sang from the heart, he would place his hand on her left breast to show just where her heart was. For nearly 17 years she worked, slept, ate, appeared in public, dated, married, and divorced at his command. The studio even exerted authority over medical crises in her life. When she became pregnant during her first marriage, her mother and studio executives pressured her to have an abortion. She complied. By 1947, Garland suffered a nervous breakdown. Her drug addiction had spiraled out of control, and her tardiness and absences from film sets led to her being fired from the Barclays of Broadway, Annie Get Your Gun, and Royal Wedding. She attempted suicide twice. In 1950, MGM suspended her for the final time. She was 30 years old and had been with the studio for 15 years. By the time MGM was done with her, Garland was addicted to pills and alcohol, suffering from an eating disorder, and unable to function without the substances that had been forced on her since she was 14. She died in 1969 at age 47 from an accidental barbiturate overdose. Her estate was worth $40,000 despite having earned millions for MGM. Frank Sinatra. Frank Sinatra came to MGM in 1943 as a singing sensation, a 27-year-old crooner who had teenage girls fainting at his concerts. Mayer signed him to capitalize on his popularity, but Sinatra's time at MGM was troubled from the start. The studio didn't know what to do with him. They cast him in light musicals opposite Gene Kelly and others, but Sinatra wanted more substantial roles. The tension between Sinatra and the studio grew as his popularity began to wane in the late 1940s. His record sales declined, his film appearances drew smaller audiences, and personal scandals involving his affair with Ava Gardner while he was still married damaged his reputation. MGM had Sinatra under contract, but increasingly saw him as a liability rather than an asset. The studio could have released him, but instead they kept him bound to his contract while giving him fewer opportunities to work. It was a form of punishment, a way of reminding him who held the power. By 1950, MGM let Sinatra go. His career was in freefall, his personal life was a mess, and the studio that had signed him as a star released him as a has-been. Sinatra's comeback with From Here to Eternity in 1953 happened at Columbia, not MGM, proving that the studio's assessment of his talent had been more about control than accurate judgment.